The latter half of this chapter revolves more around two specific powers that we've mentioned before. Though when we talked about them before, we didn't talk about them as Italy or as Germany. And so Italian unification, German unification, are actually the creation of new entities, things that had never existed before. An independent nation of Italy and an independent nation, unified nation of Italy, unified nation of Germany, hadn't been part of the European map before. Their creation makes up a big part of the story of the third quarter of the 19th century. Italian unification comes about as a result of one of the smaller Italian powers expanding its influence. In this case, it's the region known as Piedmont Savoy in the northern western portion of Italy. Piedmont Savoy, you remember I talked about in the Crimean War, had sent troops, had pitched in with the British and the French in their war with Russia. Part of this was an effort to make a friend of Louis Napoleon in France. Part of it was to justify their sort of coming out as the major Italian state. But the king of Piedmont Savoy, Victor Emmanuel, brings in a new prime minister, Camillo Cavour. And Cavour and Victor Emmanuel have dreams of unifying the Italian peninsula under a single rule, their own. And so they team up with Louis Napoleon, Napoleon III now, to provoke a war with Austria, who controls some of the eastern northern regions of Italy, including the very important city of Venice. Provoke that war with Austria and unify some of the northern and eastern portions of Italy with their northern and western territory. And all it would cost them is a couple of provinces, Nice and Savoy, that Napoleon has had his eyes on. The war goes fairly well for the Italians. They win most of their battles, but rather than risk a real big outbreak, a war between France and Austria, Napoleon's going to pull back. And this is going to force Piedmont and Savoy to moderate their goals. They don't quite get the city of Venice, but they do get much of northern Italy. Now into this mix steps a character who is an incredible hero of Italian unification, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi had been in Latin America fighting to help some of those old Spanish provinces gain their independence. And Garibaldi comes back and he unifies a cross-section of the Italian population. He gets peasants, he gets the middle class, he gets some elites, he gets northerners, he gets southerners. He builds himself an army. It starts with what he calls his 1,000, but these Garibaldi followers are going to invade Sicily down at the southern boot of Italy. They're going to capture that island, they're going to cross to the mainland, and they're going to start working their way north from that Naples and southern region of Italy. Cavour, realizing what's going on, encourages Victor Emmanuel to meet Garibaldi halfway. And so Victor Emmanuel moves south with some troops, and he meets Garibaldi in the city of Rome. When Cavour and Victor Emmanuel tell Garibaldi that he needs to do obedience to the king, Garibaldi agrees, joins his conquests with those of Piedmont and Savoy, and a whole unified Italy is established. Minus the important cities of Venice and Rome. Those are going to come along a little bit later. Venetia, Venice, is going to actually become an Italian possession when the state of Prussia and the Empire of Austria go to war in 1867. It'll be a very short war. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. And the Prussians are extremely successful in this war. Their reward to unified Italy for not taking a part in it will be Venice. And so the Austrians are forced to turn Venice over to Italy, and it's almost a complete state. In a rewind of that situation, just 4 years later, in 1871, the Italian state will gain its capital, Rome, when, once again, now a more unified Germany, but still under Prussian control, fights a very successful war with France, which we'll talk about in a moment, and upon beating the French solidly, force the French, who had been protectors of the Pope, to turn over their capacity in Rome, their control of Rome, to Italy, therefore completing Italian unification thanks in part to Prussian successes over their neighbors. That brings us to German unification. German unification is an interesting story. The man most interested or most involved in this is not going to be the king, but rather his prime minister, his president minister. Prime minister's answer to Congress or to Reichstags in this case, Otto von Bismarck's not going to answer to either. He answers only to the king. Bismarck is appointed, and Bismarck has not a German vision, but rather a greater Prussian vision. And so the things that he's going to do are going to be all about making Prussia stronger. What it results in is creating a unified Germany. Bismarck is going to pick his foes very carefully. He also works within the balance of power system. Bismarck famously is remembered for his saying, always be in the majority of three. Remember, there's 5 big powers in Europe. Bismarck wants to keep the Prussians always in the better of a 3-to-2 relationship. So as he picks his battles, he's always going to make sure he's got enough friends to win them, and win them quickly and cheaply. In the 1860s, he's going to pick a battle with the Dutch. 2 Dutch German possessions, Schleswig and Holstein, had been competed for over and over again between various powers. When Bismarck provokes the Dutch by telling him that the German populations there should be given more autonomy, the Dutch attempt to completely consolidate these 2 areas. Bismarck calls upon his German, Austrian brothers to join him in a war to help liberate these German citizens. And they deal a very quick beating to the Dutch. Bismarck then graciously splits the territories with the Austrians, who are always willing to gain territory, but makes sure that the Austrians aren't going to be happy with the way the split goes. It leads to, within just a couple of years, a cause for war with the Austrians. Now, the Austrians have not necessarily made very many friends in the recent past, and so Bismarck's going to try to isolate them. One, he keeps the English out by simply telling them it's a continental issue, and the English are willing to go along with that. The French are put off with this is a battle between Germans, don't mess with it. The Russians, who you would think might have been willing to work with the Austrians at some point, they helped them in 1848, aren't going to step in because when the Crimean War happened, the Austrians didn't help them. And so Austria is on its own. And again, Prussia is able to, through technological advances, through a more professionalized army, one that is much more mobile. Prussia has introduced railroads into its military planning. With a very short time period, the Prussians are going to beat the Austrians in a surprise upset victory. And with this, Bismarck is going to be able to add, along with his northern German territories, now a southern group of German territories. There'll be a few big states like Bavaria that still hold out, but essentially Bismarck has gotten most of the German speakers, aside from the Austrians, into his own camp. He'll finish this job in 1871 by provoking Napoleon III. As the king of Prussia is working to come to some sort of an understanding with the French, Bismarck steps in, alters a little bit of the paperwork, some of the mail going back and forth, lets the French know that this is going on, and Napoleon uses it to start rattling sabers and talking about war. Bismarck leaps into this, declares war with the French, and again, very quickly, with technological advances, with transportation advances, and because Napoleon III just isn't Napoleon I, they beat the French quickly. In fact, at the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III is actually captured on the battlefield by Prussian troops. The humiliating result is a German empire under Prussian control that is declared literally in Louis XIV's palace of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. We'll revisit that, so don't let that get too far out of your head. But it's important that the Germans have embarrassed the French at this level. It's going to bring down Napoleon III's government. They're going to be fighting. Paris is going to erupt again. The French are going to be forced to give up a couple of territories, Alsace and Lorraine, to the Germans. Those southern German states that had been a little bit reluctant to join in with Bismarck leapt in when the German flag was raised as Germany being insulted by the French. And now we have a unified Germany. A Germany that had been sort of a buffer state between all the others before this, and a battleground for the great powers to move back and forth across. This Germany, though, is very quickly going to consolidate. It's going to industrialize. It's going to get resource rich. It's going to get financially rich. It's already militarily powerful, and it is going to completely alter that balance of power. we've got another 40 years or so to go before things completely come unhinged, but we can start to think and look down the road and see how the end of that Congress Vienna balance of power system is going to explode as those five powers that were supposed to hold things together have started to go their own way, new powers have come in, and the whole balance has shifted.